On the evening of November 14, 1959, in the small town of Holcomb, Kansas, the Clutter family went about their lives as they always had. Holcomb wasn't the kind of place people worried about crime. It was quiet, isolated, a farming community where neighbors knew each other, where doors weren't always locked, and where danger felt like something that existed somewhere else. The Clutter home sat on a large stretch of land, a farmhouse surrounded by open fields, far enough from the road to feel private, but not so far that it felt alone. Inside that house lived a family that many considered ideal. Herbert Clutter, the father, was known throughout the community as a respected, disciplined man. He ran a successful farm. He was organized, methodical, and deeply principled. His wife, Bonnie, was quieter, more reserved. She struggled with her health at times, but she remained a steady presence in the home. Their daughter, Nancy, was everything people expected from someone her age. Kind, responsible, active in school and community life. Their son, Kenyon, was quieter, more focused on his hobbies, spending time working with tools, building things, keeping to himself. Together, they were seen as a model family. That evening felt no different from any other. Dinner had been prepared. Plates arranged neatly. Voices filling the space with casual conversation. There was no tension. No sign of conflict. No reason to believe anything was wrong. After dinner, the night continued quietly. Nancy spent time finishing small tasks. Kenyon moved through his routines. Herbert made sure everything was in order for the next day. It was a normal night. The kind of night that fades into memory without leaving a mark. And eventually, like every other night, it came to an end. Lights were turned off. Rooms grew quiet. The house settled into silence. One by one, they went to sleep. And outside, the darkness stretched across the fields. Nothing moved. Nothing disturbed the stillness. But sometime during that night, something changed. Not with noise. Not with warning. Just presence. Miles away, two men were already on their way. They had made a decision. A plan. One that would bring them directly to that house. They weren't from Holcomb. They didn't belong to that quiet routine. But they knew of the Clutter family. They had heard something. Something that led them to believe there was something inside that house worth taking. Money. A safe. Something valuable. At least, that's what they thought. As the night deepened, they arrived. The farmhouse stood still. Unaware. Unprepared. There were no alarms. No immediate resistance. Just a house. Filled with people who believed they were safe. The entry was quiet. Controlled. No sudden crash. No chaos. Just movement. Through a space that didn't belong to them. Inside the house, everything remained silent. Until it wasn't. The first encounter happened quickly. A presence where there shouldn't have been one. A voice in the dark. A realization that something was wrong. Confusion turned into fear. And fear turned into something far worse. The intruders moved through the house. Step by step. Room by room. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They were focused. They were looking for something. But as the minutes passed, it became clear. What they were looking for wasn't there. There was no safe filled with money. No hidden fortune. No reason for them to be there at all. And in that moment, everything changed. Because now, this wasn't about theft anymore. Now, it was about control. And inside that quiet farmhouse, something unimaginable began to unfold. The family was no longer asleep. They were aware, afraid, but there was nowhere to go. The isolation that once made their home feel peaceful, now made it something else entirely. Trapped. The intruders moved with certainty. They separated the family. One by one, they took control of the situation. And as the tension inside that house grew, so did the realization that this night was not going to end the way it began. Outside, the fields remained still. The town slept peacefully. No one knew. No one heard. No one saw. But inside that house, something irreversible had already begun. And by the time the sun rose, everything would be different. Because what happened next wasn't just a crime. It was something far more disturbing. Something that would shock an entire nation and leave a mark that would never fully fade. And as the hours passed, the quiet night that once felt so ordinary was slowly turning into something unthinkable. Something no one in that town was prepared for. Sometimes, the most terrifying moments aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The moments where nothing is said, but everything is understood. Because inside that farmhouse, as the night stretched on, the Clutter family began to realize something no one should ever have to face. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't someone who would simply leave. This was something else. Something far more dangerous. The intruders moved with control. Not rushed. Not panicked. They spoke. Calmly. Directly. And what they said made it clear. They believed something valuable was hidden inside that house. Money. A safe. Something worth taking. But the truth was simple. There was no safe. No hidden fortune. Herbert Clutter had never kept large amounts of cash inside the home. Everything was handled through checks, records, order, the kind of structure that made sense in life. But in that moment, offered no protection at all. As the realization set in, tension inside the house began to shift. Because now, the intruders were faced with something they hadn't expected. And when a plan begins to fall apart, it rarely ends well. One by one, the family was moved. Not violently at first. Not with chaos. But with control. Herbert was taken downstairs. Bound. Kenyon was placed in another room. Separated. Nancy and Bonnie were kept apart from the others. Each of them isolated. Each of them uncertain. And in that separation, something changed. Because isolation does something to people. It removes comfort. It removes certainty. It replaces it with one thing. Fear. Inside their own home, they were no longer safe. And the intruders knew it. Time passed slowly. Conversations continued. Questions asked. Answers repeated. Where is the safe? There isn't one. Again. And again. The same question. The same answer. And with every repetition, frustration began to build. Because the truth didn't match what the intruders had believed. And that truth was becoming harder to accept. At some point, the situation crossed a line. The moment where control turns into something else. Something irreversible. The calm began to fade. And in its place, something darker emerged. The house remained quiet. No screams reaching beyond the walls. No sounds loud enough to alert anyone outside. Just contained tension. And then, one decision changed everything. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. The kind of decision that doesn't come from panic, but from something deeper, something colder. One by one, the silence inside that house was broken. Not with chaos, not with noise, but with finality. Each moment, calculated. Each action, intentional. There was no struggle that could change the outcome. No opportunity to escape. Just an ending that came too quickly. And when it was over, the house returned to silence. The same silence it had held just hours before. But now, everything inside it had changed. For lives, gone. A family, erased. And outside, nothing had shifted. The fields remained still. The town slept. No one knew. No one could have imagined what had just happened. But the night wasn't over. Because after everything, the intruders didn't leave immediately. Instead, they moved through the house. Looking, thinking, as if searching for something they had missed. But there was nothing left to find. The plan had failed. The reason for being there had never existed. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Leave. They exited the house. Just as quietly as they had entered. No alarms. No witnesses. Just darkness. Covering their departure. And by the time the first light of morning began to rise, they were gone. Completely. Hours later, life in Holcomb began to move again. The sun came up. Neighbors went about their routines. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. When the Clutter family failed to appear, people noticed. Nancy hadn't shown up for her usual commitments. Her absence felt wrong. Concern grew quickly. And when someone finally went to check on the house, what they discovered shattered that quiet sense of safety forever. Inside the farmhouse, the truth was waiting. Authorities were called. And as investigators stepped into the home, they were met with something they had never experienced before. The scene was still. Unnaturally still. And as they moved from room to room, the reality began to unfold. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaotic. This had been controlled, deliberate, every detail, pointing to something calculated. The town of Holcomb was no longer the same. News spread quickly. A family, respected, well-known, gone overnight. It didn't make sense. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect, just questions. And those questions began to spread far beyond the town itself. Because this wasn't just a tragedy anymore. It was a mystery, one that demanded answers. But the truth was already moving further away. Because somewhere, beyond the quiet fields of Kansas, the two men responsible were already gone. No witnesses, no immediate trail, just distance. And time. Time to think. Time to decide what came next. Because what they had done couldn't be undone. And what came after would determine everything. As investigators worked to piece together what had happened inside that farmhouse, one question became impossible to ignore. Who would do something like this? And why? But even more unsettling was the realization that the answers weren't waiting inside that house. They were out there, somewhere, with two men who had just disappeared into the night. And as the investigation began, the search for those men would uncover something far more disturbing than anyone expected. Because this wasn't just about what happened inside that house anymore. It was about who was capable of it, and what they might do next. Some crimes end when the violence stops. Others only begin there. Because when the Clutter family was discovered that morning, the horror didn't end. It spread across the quiet fields of Holcomb, through every home, into every conversation. Fear replaced certainty, because something had happened that no one believed could ever happen there. And the most disturbing part wasn't just what had been done. It was this. Whoever was responsible was still out there, somewhere, moving, thinking, blending in. And as investigators stood inside that farmhouse, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, they knew one thing immediately. This wasn't going to be simple. The crime scene told a story, a controlled entry, a methodical movement through the house, a sequence of actions that suggested planning, not impulse. There were no signs of robbery, nothing taken, which meant whatever had brought those men there hadn't been real. But the outcome was. Investigators began to reconstruct the night. They traced movements, mapped positions, studied every detail, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Two individuals, working together, one more dominant, more decisive, the other following, but still participating. The evidence didn't point to professionals. It pointed to something else, something more unpredictable, because this wasn't just about control. There was something unstable beneath it, something that made the situation shift. When the plan failed, the next step was clear. Find them. But that was easier said than done. Holcomb wasn't a place where strangers stood out easily. People came and went. Travelers passed through. And without a clear description, the search expanded quickly. Roadblocks were set. Interviews conducted. Leads followed. But nothing immediate. Nothing solid. Days passed. And with each passing day, the pressure grew. Not just from the investigation, but from the public. Because this case had already begun to spread beyond Kansas. The idea that a quiet family could be targeted, with no warning, no motive, it unsettled people. It made them question something they had always believed. That home meant safety. But now, that belief was broken. Weeks passed. And then, finally, something changed. A lead. It didn't come from the crime scene. It came from a conversation. A detail that had been mentioned long before the crime ever happened. A name. Someone had once spoken about the Clutter family. About a safe. About money. A claim that wasn't true, but had been believed. That name led investigators to two men, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. They weren't from Holcomb, but they had passed through Kansas. And more importantly, they had a connection to the story that had started everything. The false idea that the Clutter family had money hidden inside their home. Suddenly, the pieces began to fit. The motive wasn't personal. It wasn't revenge. It was based on something far simpler. A lie. A misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding had led to one of the most devastating crimes the town had ever seen. Investigators moved quickly. They tracked movements, followed timelines, and eventually, they found them. Not in Kansas, but miles away, in another state, trying to move on, trying to disappear into a different life. But what they had done couldn't be left behind. They were arrested. And when they were questioned, the truth began to surface. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Details that matched the scene. Actions that confirmed what investigators had already suspected. And eventually, confessions. What had happened inside that house was no longer a mystery. It had been planned. But not in the way people expected. The plan was simple. Enter the house. Find the safe. Take the money. Leave. But the safe didn't exist. And in that moment, the plan collapsed. What followed was a decision. Not one driven by necessity, but one driven by something darker. Something that couldn't be undone. The trial that followed drew national attention. People wanted to understand how something like this could happen. How two men could walk into a home and destroy an entire family for something that wasn't even real. The courtroom became a place where every detail was examined, every action questioned, every moment of that night revisited. And yet, even with all the answers, something still didn't make sense. Because understanding what happened doesn't always explain why. Both men were found guilty, and in time, they were sentenced. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But for the people of Holcomb, that wasn't enough. Because something had been taken from them that couldn't be restored. Their sense of safety, their belief in normal life, the idea that something like this could never happen there. The Clutter home no longer felt like just a house. It became a symbol, a reminder of how quickly everything can change, and how fragile that sense of normalcy really is. Even today, the story remains, not just as a case, but as something more, a reflection of how danger doesn't always come from where we expect, of how a single false idea can lead to unimaginable consequences, and of how sometimes the quietest nights hold the darkest endings. Because the truth is, nothing about that night felt unusual until it was too late. A family sat down for dinner, went about their routine, went to sleep, and never woke up, all because two men believed something that wasn't true, and decided to act on it anyway. So what do we take from a story like this? Is it about crime? About violence? Or is it something deeper? Something more unsettling? The idea that sometimes there is no grand motive, no complex reason, just a moment, a decision, and the consequences that follow. Because in the end, this wasn't just a crime. It was a reminder that even in the safest places, even in the quietest homes, something unthinkable can happen. And sometimes it begins with nothing more than a normal night. Let me know what you think, because stories like this don't just end. They stay with us long after the silence returns.